the first question is about John Kerry's visit to Moscow, and it seems that the Secretary of State, struck a conciliatory tone while talking to his Russian counterparts. Was that the right thing to do? You think under these circumstances?
Well, certainly, I think there's a basket of issues upon which the U.S. and Russia are engaging on. So I think having a constructive relationship is always better than having the lines of communications closed. I think on the Russian side, they want to be able to link lots of different issues together, right? Whether it's Syria, cooperation against ISIS, Ukraine, whereas the challenge for the U.S. side is managing these issues each in their logical order in distinct ways. So I think there's some room for talks, but ultimately the sides also face lots of areas where they disagree on.
Well, let's try to go down that logical list of problems. The Russian involvement in Syria, what did it lead to? Did it really help to path the way to the negotiations between Syrian sides?
Well, I think Russia achieved many of its objectives in Syria, and that's why it withdrew. It actually tilted the military balance in favor of Assad. It established a Russian foothold, a forward basing presence that it'll retain, even if it's not conducting a bombing campaign. And I think most importantly, it signaled both to the Russian public and the world that Russia is a Middle Eastern power. It's not just a regional power, it's a world power, and it wants to be involved in the making of rules for war and peace and conflict resolution. After Russia achieved all those objectives, it actually left at a time which was favorable to it, right? Because in the future, the war would become more costly, you might see more Russian casualties, and the question of civilian casualties inflicted by Russia was also starting to become a real political liability for the Kremlin. So this quick in, quick out, I think Moscow achieved many of its objectives.
But isn't that short involvement actually proves that Russia cannot sustain being on global scene for a long time? So it's like brief cameo appearance, back and forth, and we're done. We cannot be a global power they cannot be a global power for a prolonged time
Yeah, I mean, I think you get at one of the short versus long-term kind of ironies here. Russia wants to be part of the conversation. It wants to be consulted. It wants to be respected. But the question is it willing to put in the long-term engagement and real sustained involvement in these issues? I think that's an open question.
That Putin's attempt to make himself relevant again after entering Syria, did he achieve that goal, or he is still viewed by many in the West as a regional leader?
I think actually he has achieved that goal. I think the modus operandi during the Obama administration that Russia, and especially the Ukraine crisis, that this was serious, but it was also a regional issue, right? That it didn't have global implications. And a lot of European countries felt that way too. What changed things was, of course, the bombing of the civilian airliner, right? Especially in a place like Holland, all of a sudden, the global implications of what was going on in eastern Ukraine were made clear. And now the Syria action, I think, has forced U.S. officials to say, no, even though we want to put Russia in the box, we acknowledge that they can change facts on the ground. They're going to be part of a conversation. What it's not going to do is change the calculation on the sanctions, which have very specific targets and very specific goals, either the Crimea sanctions or the Donbass intervention sanctions. So if Russia wants concessions on those particular areas, I think that's going to be a lot more difficult. But certainly I think Russia has made itself part of the conversation. Now, whether it's considered to be a credible partner, a serious or committed partner, I think that's a separate issue, but I think it has reasserted its relevance in the thinking of a lot of U.S. policymakers.
And the second issue, of course, is global security, also related to Syria and ISIS. Don't you find that the reaction of Russian authorities to the Belgian crisis, to the Belgian tragedy, was a bit odd. You know, like there were statements from the president that were, you know, expressing condolences, and then there were others that were outright scandalous. I don't remember people being so angry about the West.
Yeah, you know, it was odd. I would call it tone deaf, right? In times like this, in times of tragedy, you know, targeting of civilians, all these deaths, I think you have to strike a very conciliatory, sympathetic tone. And I think statements that came from a lot of Russian officials was mixing and matching a kind of, you know, show of sympathy with then a challenge about Western security policy. That, oh, you see, we're not the threats, it's ISIS that's our common threat. That's very tone deaf in a time of tragedy, right? Mm-hmm. And all these NATO countries, even the ones that might have sympathy towards Russia, they see it as opportunistic, that you're using this tragedy as an opportunity to score political points. So I don't think Russia came off very well with these statements.
Does it relate to this new tactics of Russian authorities and leadership that everything is a bargaining chip? You know, like we will express our condolences if you stop criticizing us on Savchenko, for example.
Yeah, this is exactly right. So, and here I think you see the fundamental differences between kind of Russian approach to these global issues and the American approach to these global issues. For the U.S., because it manages such a global array of allies, institutions, commitments, it has to have very careful consultations and statements about these issue areas, about Ukraine, about rotational troops in NATO, about the situation in Syria, and it moves in a very slow, deliberative way. For Russia, being a great power means mixing and matching everything, as you say, bargaining everything, linking everything, everything's a deal. You know, sanctions in Ukraine should be on the table for cooperation in the Syrian peace process. Whereas in the West, these things all have their own logic. They're compartmentalized. They each have sort of routines and procedures. So I think this, this cross-pollination of everything, this bargaining of everything, I think it might strike some as, a kind of a seductive, tempting way to go. But in reality, it just creates a set of policy headaches when you start linking everything with everything else.
And in your view, the whole bargaining situation around Nadezhda Savchenko, where could that lead?
I think what we're seeing is, of course, the issue has become terribly politicized. It's been used as a political banner by both sides, statements by Ukrainian President Poroshenko, counter statements on the Moscow side. We hear talk of a possible prisoner exchange as part of the conclusion of a Minsk process that presupposes that we will have a robust Minsk process, which I'm skeptical about. But hopefully, Savchenko will be exchanged in some form of quid pro quo going forward, because her case really is exceptional and actually just quite odd.
And of course, this being election year in the United States, I have to ask you the question, looking forward, do you think that the next president of the United States will have more sort of clear policy towards Russia?
That's a great question. I think what we're seeing now in the primaries is that the clear distinction in Russia policy between Democrats and Republicans, right, between foreign policy hawks and doves, that's exploding, right? That you have factions who take different positions on the issues in both parties. So in the Republican Party, you have Donald Trump, right, who says, I think I can talk to Putin, right? We're both strong leaders. We can both do deals. And then you have Ted Cruz, who is very anti-Russia, right? A real hawk. Similarly, on the Democratic side, you have Hillary Clinton, who, in essence would maintain a similar policy to the Obama administration, and maybe even a little more robust on the one hand, and then Bernie Sanders, who's more of, that let's not be too aggressively involved in the world kind of stance. So I think part of what comes out, it's going to depend on who the nominees are in these different parties, what the Russia policy is going to look like.
Putin's own persona in the United States became sort of like a part of almost pop culture. He's used in political commercials. Trump used him in his commercial and so forth. So is that just a sort of like a general picture of a boogeyman, of a strong opponent, or Putin's persona becomes sort of relevant in the United States psyche, in American psyche?
You're right. Putin's personality is everywhere, right? He's invoked during the presidential campaign. Well, how are you going to negotiate with Putin, right, if you can't even, participate in the debate, right, is one of the lines. Or oftentimes Putin's strength and decisiveness as a leader is contrasted to President Obama's kind of weaker and more deliberate, cautious style. So Putin is very much an icon also within the U.S. political process. I think a lot of this is decontextualized. I think a lot of what the commentary doesn't pick up on is that Putin can appear to be strong and decisive, A, because he doesn't have a lot of internal checks on his power, and B, because he doesn't have a lot of global alliances and commitment. So that enables Putin to come into into Syria quickly and then withdraw from Syria quickly because he doesn't actually have to consult with many partners and many allies about his decisions. Obama, on the other hand, has to maintain these various commitments, has to negotiate the Gulf countries, Turkey, NATO allies, before he takes any types of decisions. So part of it, this decisiveness is actually a much lesser geopolitical position. Russia is a geopolitical power, but barely, and in some circumstances, right? And that it aspires to be a global power, even though a lot of its activities and its actions are regionally focused.